On a humid night in the late 1840s, several mounted men left a plantation road in southern Georgia and entered a stretch of woodland that locals rarely crossed after dark. They carried lanterns, ropes, and rifles. The men were not soldiers, and they were not law officers. They were slave catchers, private contractors paid to recover people who had fled plantations and were believed to be hiding somewhere beyond the cypress swamps. They expected the work to be routine. Runaways often traveled in small groups. They avoided roads, followed rivers, and moved slowly through forest corridors that were difficult to patrol. Slave hunters knew these patterns. Their business depended on it. They tracked footprints, broken reeds, displaced bark. They listened for movement in the brush. But that night, the hunters rode into the woods and never returned. By morning, their horses were found wandering near the edge of a clearing, saddles still strapped tight, reins dragging in the dirt. A few rifles were discovered leaning against a fallen log as if someone had set them down in a moment of distraction. The men themselves were gone. No bodies were recovered, no campfire, no sign of a struggle that could be easily explained. If you appreciate careful historical storytelling, stories reconstructed slowly from fragments like these, you might consider subscribing. There are many accounts like this buried in old documents, waiting to be examined. The men who disappeared that night were part of a growing profession that had developed alongside the expansion of slavery in the American South. As plantations spread and enslaved populations increased, so did escape attempts. With them came an economy of recovery. Slave catchers operated in a legal gray space. Some worked directly for plantation owners, others traveled independently, responding to advertisements in newspapers that described escaped individuals and offered payment for their return. The amounts varied, but the work could be profitable. Their methods were systematic. They carried printed notices describing physical features, height, scars, manner of speech. They questioned travelers at ferry crossings. They inspected barns, sheds, and abandoned structures where fugitives might rest during the day. And they learned to think like the people they pursued. Many of them believed their work was necessary. Plantation owners argued that property law demanded enforcement. Local authorities often agreed. To these hunters, their role was not cruelty, but order. They were restoring what the law defined as ownership. Yet the forests of the southern states were large, and control was never absolute. Enslaved communities developed their own networks of information. Word moved quietly along riverbanks, through kitchens, across churchyards. Safe paths were shared. Places to hide were remembered. In many areas, the landscape itself became part of that knowledge. The men who rode into the Georgia woods that night believed they were following a small group of runaways reported 2 days earlier. Witnesses claimed the fugitives had been seen moving toward a swampy tract about 12 miles from the nearest plantation road. It was the kind of terrain that slowed pursuit. Still, the hunters were confident. They had done this before. Lanterns were lit as the sun dropped behind the trees. Horses moved carefully between thick trunks and hanging moss. Somewhere ahead, they assumed frightened people were trying to disappear into darkness. The hunters expected to find them before dawn. Instead, by sunrise, only the horses were left. News of the disappearance moved slowly at first. Plantation communities in the region were accustomed to isolated incidents, escaped laborers, small disputes, brief searches that ended without result. But the absence of several armed men was unusual enough to require attention. Within a day, a small group of planters and local deputies organized a search. They began where the horses had been found. The clearing itself was narrow, bordered by thick pine and patches of marsh grass. Hoofprints crossed the soil in several directions. Lantern oil had spilled near a stump, leaving a dark stain that had not yet dried under the morning heat. There was no immediate evidence of violence. The rifles discovered earlier were examined carefully. Their chambers were still loaded. No shots had been fired. One weapon carried the initials of a man named Thomas Whitaker, a hunter who had worked the region for nearly a decade. Whitaker was known among plantation owners as disciplined and cautious. He had tracked dozens of fugitives across county lines. Those who knew him did not believe he would abandon a rifle voluntarily. The searchers followed the most visible tracks deeper into the woodland. The ground there was uneven, covered with roots and damp leaves that preserved impressions only briefly. Horses had moved through recently, but the direction was difficult to interpret. Some prints suggested the animals had turned suddenly. Others stopped where the earth hardened into packed clay. By midday, the group had located several personal items scattered across a narrow trail: a coil of rope, a metal canteen, and a torn fragment of cloth that may have belonged to one of the riders. None of it provided a clear explanation. The objects looked less like evidence of conflict and more like things set aside in haste. Conversations among the searchers remained measured. No one openly speculated about what might have occurred, but certain possibilities were quietly dismissed. A simple accident seemed unlikely. Multiple men did not vanish together without leaving some trace of injury or distress. The runaways themselves were discussed as a potential factor. Some believed the fugitives had organized resistance. That theory carried weight among plantation owners who had long suspected communication between enslaved communities across plantations. Yet others noted the imbalance. The hunters were armed, mounted, and experienced. Confronting them directly would have required preparation and numbers. Neither had been reported. Late that afternoon, the search party reached the outer edge of a cypress basin where shallow water spread across a wide depression in the land. Movement through the area was slow. Horses avoided the deeper mud, forcing riders onto narrow strips of firmer ground. It was there that one of the deputies noticed something unusual. A series of footprints, partially filled with water, moved along the bank and then disappeared into a stand of reeds. The tracks were smaller than those left by boots. Bare feet, perhaps several individuals traveling together. The prints did not lead away from the swamp. They went into it. The searchers stood quietly for a moment, studying the wet soil. Someone remarked that fugitives sometimes used water to conceal their path. Wading through a marsh could break a trail and confuse pursuit. It was a known tactic. But in this case, something about the spacing of the tracks suggested the people moving there had not been fleeing quickly. The impressions were steady, deliberate, as if whoever entered the swamp believed they would not be followed. The cypress basin marked a natural boundary that most patrols avoided unless necessary. The ground beneath the water was uneven, and horses could become trapped in deep mud without warning. Even experienced riders approached such terrain with caution. The men studying the tracks along the bank understood this. Moving into the swamp on horseback would slow them considerably. Progress would depend on narrow ridges of soil hidden beneath shallow water, places known mainly to people who had crossed the basin many times before. For anyone unfamiliar with the area, travel there could become uncertain within minutes. Still, the possibility that the fugitives had taken this route required attention. Two members of the search party dismounted and tested the edge of the water with long branches cut from nearby saplings. The mud beneath the surface shifted easily.
A step taken in the wrong place could sink past the knee. Horses would refuse to enter deeper sections, forcing riders to continue on foot.
The group paused to consider whether the missing hunters might have followed the same trail. Some believed Whitaker and the others would not have risked their horses in such conditions. A hunter's horse was valuable equipment. Losing one to the swamp would end the pursuit and create a new problem entirely. Yet others argued that the promise of recovering several fugitives at once could justify the attempt. Advertisements placed in regional newspapers often offered higher payments for multiple returns. A few planters present at the search had posted those notices themselves. They understood the incentive structure clearly. While the discussion continued, one of the deputies moved along the edge of the reeds where the prints had vanished. He was careful not to disturb the mud further. After several minutes, he called the others over and pointed to a patch of flattened grass partially hidden by water. The depression suggested that something heavy had been dragged across the surface. It was not a clean mark. The reeds had bent and then lifted again in different directions, as if weight had shifted while moving through them. The disturbance extended only a short distance before disappearing entirely into thicker growth. No clear track continued beyond it. The searchers exchanged restrained glances. None spoke immediately. Drag marks could mean many things. A fallen tree branch pulled aside, equipment repositioned, or something else that no one was prepared to define without stronger evidence. They continued examining the surrounding area in widening circles. More small objects emerged from the mud as the afternoon passed. A leather strap, a bent lantern hook, a single glove that one planter recognized as belonging to Caleb Renshaw. Renshaw had joined the hunting party 2 weeks earlier after working along the river trade routes. He had been described as quiet but reliable. The scattered items did not form a pattern that investigators could easily reconstruct. Each piece appeared isolated from the others. None lay close enough to indicate a single moment of confrontation. Instead, the distribution suggested movement through the area over time. By evening, the group reached a quiet understanding that continuing into the swamp before nightfall would be impractical. Light was fading, and the ground ahead remained uncertain. They agreed to withdraw temporarily and return the next morning with additional men. Before leaving, one of the deputies stood for several moments beside the reeds where the tracks had ended. The water there was still, disturbed only by insects touching the surface. He listened carefully. The basin remained silent. The following morning, the search resumed with a larger party. Word had spread across nearby plantations during the night. Several owners sent laborers and overseers to assist, not only out of concern for the missing hunters, but also because the situation carried a practical implication. If a group of fugitives had managed to overpower armed pursuers, it suggested a level of organization that planters preferred not to acknowledge openly. The expanded search moved toward the basin shortly after sunrise. Some men remained on higher ground to observe the surrounding woodland, while others prepared to enter the wetland itself. Horses were left behind along the tree line. The mud near the water would not support their weight. Movement through the basin proved slow.
Cypress knees rose from the surface like dull stakes, forcing careful steps between them. The water reached the shins in some places and the thighs in others. Each man carried a long branch to test the firmness of the soil ahead. The reeds where the earlier tracks had disappeared were examined again. In daylight, The disturbance in the grass appeared more complex than it had the previous afternoon. Several narrow passages could now be seen where vegetation had parted and then closed again. These openings did not follow a single straight direction. Instead, they angled slightly apart from one another before merging deeper within the marsh. It gave the impression that multiple people had moved through the same section, but not in a tight formation. One overseer suggested the fugitives had separated deliberately to confuse pursuit. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, and it allowed the men present to interpret the signs in a familiar way. Escaped individuals often relied on misdirection. Yet the absence of boot prints remained difficult to explain. The hunters who had vanished wore heavy riding boots that typically left clear impressions in soft ground. Even partial tracks would have appeared along the bank or in the shallow mud where the water thinned. None were visible. As the group pressed farther into the basin, additional objects surfaced. A hat was caught between two cypress roots. A powder horn floated partially submerged near a cluster of reeds. Both were identified by men who had seen the hunters ride out 2 nights earlier. These discoveries produced a quiet shift in tone. Until that moment, some members of the search had spoken as if the missing men might simply be delayed, perhaps forced to take shelter or forced to circle back along another route. The presence of personal belongings scattered across the marsh made that possibility harder to sustain. The basin was not a place where experienced riders discarded equipment casually. Around midday, one of the laborers stopped abruptly and signaled to the others. In the mud ahead, partly covered by shallow water, lay the impression of a human body that had rested there long enough to shape the soil. The outline was incomplete but recognizable. Shoulders, torso, the faint suggestion of bent knees. No body remained in the depression, only the mark itself. The men studied it without speaking for several seconds. The overseer nearest the spot eventually stepped closer and placed his branch into the hollow to measure its depth. The mud had settled again. Whatever had pressed into it was no longer there. The depression in the mud forced the search party to reconsider several earlier assumptions. Up to that point, most of the discussion had focused on the movements of the fugitives. The working belief was that the runaways had passed through the basin and that the hunters had pursued them somewhere beyond it. The outline in the soil suggested a different sequence of events. Someone had fallen or been forced down inside the marsh itself. The men surrounding the mark did not rush to conclusions. Instead, they examined the area slowly, measuring distances between disturbed patches of watergrass and the scattered equipment recovered earlier that morning. When viewed together, these fragments began to form a rough corridor of movement through the basin. It was not a straight line. Objects appeared in irregular intervals, sometimes 30 or 40 yards apart. A hat here, a strap there, a lantern piece farther ahead. The pattern indicated gradual displacement rather than a single concentrated event. Several participants proposed that the hunters had been separated. If the riders had dismounted to pursue people on foot, they might have spread out across the marsh, each man following a different direction. In that case, confusion could easily develop once visibility dropped and the ground became unstable. But this interpretation raised another question. Why would experienced hunters abandon the relative safety of dry land to enter unfamiliar swamp terrain at night? Those who knew Whitaker repeated the same observation offered earlier in the search. He was not careless. His decisions usually reflected practical calculation. If he led the others into the basin, he likely believed the fugitives could not escape without passing through it. That possibility pointed to something more structured than a simple chase. The searchers continued forward, moving slowly to avoid disturbing what little evidence remained. At one point, a laborer uncovered a length of rope buried in the mud beneath a thin layer of water. The rope had been cut cleanly, its fibers sharply parted rather than frayed. A knife had been used.
The overseer who inspected it noted that hunters often carried such rope to restrain captured fugitives before transporting them back to plantation roads. Cutting it suggested that someone had decided the restraint was no longer useful or that it had been removed deliberately.
No one present offered a firm explanation. As the afternoon wore on, the basin revealed fewer objects. The disturbed vegetation gradually thinned, and the ground beneath the water became firmer. It appeared that whatever movement had taken place within the marsh had begun to settle again. The corridor of scattered items simply ended. Beyond that point, the swamp looked undisturbed, as though no one had crossed it recently. The searchers reached the opposite bank shortly before sunset. From there, the land rose into a stretch of dense forest similar to the one where the hunters had first entered 2 nights earlier. No tracks could be found on the drier soil. It was as if the activity within the basin had dissolved before reaching the far side. The men stood quietly at the edge of the trees, studying the ground for several minutes. Eventually, one of the deputies spoke in a restrained tone. If the hunters had entered the marsh and failed to emerge from it, then the basin itself had become the central location of the disappearance. The fugitives might still be somewhere nearby. But the hunters had vanished inside the swamp. By the 3rd day, the search had grown more organized. Plantation owners from neighboring counties began sending additional men, partly out of obligation and partly from unease. The disappearance of several hunters did not represent only a personal loss. It suggested a disruption in a system that many relied upon to maintain control. If men trained for pursuit could vanish while performing their work, it raised questions that few wanted to confront directly. A temporary camp was established on dry ground not far from the basin. From there, smaller teams moved outward each morning to examine specific sections of the marsh. The method was slow and deliberate. Searchers used poles to probe the mud in places where the water deepened. They parted clusters of reeds and checked the roots of fallen cypress trees. Occasionally, they discovered additional fragments belonging to the missing men: a small pouch containing flint, the metal frame of a lantern crushed flat, the buckle from a saddle strap. None of these objects were located close to the body-shaped depression found earlier. Instead, they appeared in scattered pockets, sometimes 50 yards apart, sometimes farther. The spacing gave the impression that the basin had been crossed by several individuals moving independently rather than as a single group. This detail complicated the prevailing theories. If the hunters had entered the marsh in numbers, they might have expected to maintain some visual contact with one another. Experienced trackers rarely separated completely at night, especially in terrain that distorted sound and direction. Yet the pattern of recovered items suggested that separation had occurred. Some members of the search party began to suspect that the hunters had entered the marsh under conditions that reduced their ability to coordinate movement. Darkness alone might explain part of it. The basin, filled with standing water and dense vegetation, absorbed noise and reflected lantern light unevenly. But another factor gradually entered the discussion: knowledge of the landscape. Several enslaved laborers assisting the search had grown up in the region and were familiar with the marsh from childhood. When asked quietly about the basin, they described narrow paths of firmer ground that wound through the water in irregular patterns. These natural ridges were difficult to identify without experience. Following the wrong direction could lead someone into deeper mud, where progress became exhausting. The laborers did not speak dramatically about these features. Their explanations were practical, offered in the tone of people describing everyday geography. Still, the implication was clear. Someone who understood the basin well could move through it with relative confidence, while others struggled to keep pace. By late afternoon, one of the deputies returned to the area where the earlier depression had been located. He studied the surrounding waterline again, this time focusing not on what was present, but on what was missing. No clear boot impressions had been discovered anywhere within the marsh. Bare footprints had appeared at the edge, but the heavy boots worn by the hunters had left almost no trace beyond the bank. It was possible that water had erased them, yet the mud preserved other shapes with surprising clarity. The deputy considered this quietly. If the hunters had been forced to remove their boots at some point, perhaps to move more easily through the water, it might explain the absence of those marks. But removing boots in a swamp carried its own risks. The thought lingered as evening approached. Something about the basin suggested that the hunters had lost control of the situation earlier than anyone had first assumed. During the fourth day of the search, attention shifted away from the center of the basin and toward the communities surrounding it. Until then, most effort had focused on the physical landscape, mud, water, and scattered belongings. But several deputies began to consider another possibility. If fugitives knew where the islands were located, they might have used them as temporary refuges while moving through the basin. More importantly, those locations could allow a group to observe anyone entering the swamp. The deputy thanked him for the explanation and wrote a short note in his ledger. Later that evening, he shared the conversation with the others at the campfire. No one reacted dramatically. The idea simply settled into the growing list of possibilities. If the runaways had been able to watch the hunters from hidden ground, they might have anticipated their movements. That knowledge alone could change the balance between pursuer and pursued. The basin, once viewed as an obstacle to escape, now looked increasingly like terrain that favored whoever understood it best. On the fifth morning, the search party returned to the basin with a slightly altered objective. Instead of scanning the open water for additional objects, the men concentrated on the thicker growth where the marsh vegetation rose several feet above the surface. These dense pockets had been passed earlier without much attention. Now they were approached carefully, with poles used to part the reeds before anyone stepped forward. The laborers who knew the area best guided the effort. They moved slowly, identifying places where the mud beneath the water grew unexpectedly firm. In several instances, they stopped and pointed to narrow ridges that curved through the basin in ways that would not have been visible to an unfamiliar traveler. These raised strips of earth were sometimes no wider than a wagon board, but they supported a person's weight. Following them required patience. The searchers began mapping these routes in rough sketches drawn inside a deputy's ledger. Each ridge connected to another in an uneven pattern, forming a kind of hidden network through the marsh. The paths were not straight and rarely led directly across the basin. Instead, they looped and angled before reaching slightly higher ground concealed by clusters of reeds. One such patch was discovered shortly before noon. From a distance, it appeared no different from the surrounding vegetation. Up close, however, the water receded enough to reveal a mound of packed soil beneath the grass. The area measured perhaps 20 feet across, large enough for several people to stand without sinking into the mud. The surface bore signs of recent use. Several flattened sections suggested that individuals had remained there for some time. The reeds along one edge had been parted in a way that created a narrow opening toward the basin's center. From that position, someone could watch the waterline where the hunters would have entered the swamp 2 nights earlier. The men studying the site did not need to speak much to understand its implications. If fugitives had taken shelter here, they would have had a clear view of approaching lantern light moving through the darkness. They could observe the riders while remaining concealed themselves. More interesting still, the patch contained small fragments of material that did not belong naturally in the marsh. One of the laborers uncovered a length of cloth tucked beneath the grass.
Another found a broken piece of wood shaped like part of a tool handle. Neither item appeared connected to the missing hunters. These objects looked older, worn by moisture and time. Their presence suggested that the patch had been used repeatedly rather than on a single night. The deputy overseeing the search crouched near the edge of the mound and studied the narrow ridges leading away from it. From this vantage point, at least 3 separate paths extended into the basin. Anyone familiar with those routes could leave the island quickly and move in different directions. He wrote a few brief notes and closed the ledger. The basin was beginning to resemble less of a random landscape and more of a place that certain people understood intimately, perhaps well enough to shape what happened there. The discovery of the hidden mound shifted the investigation from speculation towards reconstruction. Until then, most interpretations of the event had focused on chance, poor visibility, unstable ground, or confusion during pursuit. The existence of concealed ground within the marsh suggested something more deliberate. The basin might have functioned not only as a refuge, but also a place where movement could be directed by those who understood its layout. Later that afternoon, the deputies began retracing the hunters' likely route into the swamp.
They started from the clearing where the horses had first been found and walked the same narrow bank where the barefoot impressions had been recorded earlier in the week. The soil there still carried faint signs of passage, though time and water had softened their outlines. The searchers attempted to imagine how the scene might have appeared at night. Lantern light would have been limited. Dense vegetation absorbed sound and distorted distance. A rider stepping from dry land into the water would have experienced immediate resistance from the mud beneath the surface. Each movement would require balance and caution. If the hunters believed they were following a small group of fugitives, they might have entered the basin with confidence but little coordination. The deputy leading the reconstruction paused near the spot where the earlier drag marks had been observed. From there he looked toward the concealed mound discovered that morning. Even in daylight, the patch of higher ground was difficult to identify. In darkness, it would have been almost invisible. Someone standing there could watch the hunters approach long before being noticed. Another possibility began to emerge from this arrangement. If the fugitives had waited on that mound, they would not necessarily need to flee immediately. Instead, they could allow the hunters to move deeper into the basin, where footing became uncertain. At that point, the riders would have been forced to dismount. Once separated from their horses and spread across unfamiliar ridges, the hunters' advantage in weapons and mobility would diminish quickly. A man balancing on a narrow strip of mud could not move with the same speed or control he possessed on open ground. The reconstruction did not require speculation about dramatic confrontation. The basin itself imposed enough limitations. Later that evening, one of the laborers assisting the search mentioned another detail almost in passing. According to him, several enslaved men from nearby plantations had spent years cutting timber along the edges of the swamp before being reassigned to field work. During those seasons, they had learned the location of many of the hidden ridges. The comment was delivered quietly, without accusation. Still, it introduced a new layer to the story. Knowledge of the basin had not been confined to a single plantation or group. Over time, different labor crews had moved through the area for practical work. Each would have remembered certain paths. By the time darkness settled over the camp that night, the deputies had begun to view the disappearance less as an isolated accident and more as an encounter shaped by geography, patience, and a form of preparation that did not require written plans. By the end of the first week, the search party began shifting its attention from the landscape to the sequence of human decisions that may have unfolded inside it. The basin itself was no longer mysterious. Its hidden ridges, shallow channels, and small islands had been mapped roughly in the deputy's ledger. What remained unclear was the moment when the hunters lost control of the situation.
One possibility was discussed quietly among the deputies during the evenings. If the fugitives had known the hunters were coming, they may not have intended simply to pass through the marsh. Instead, they might have slowed their movement deliberately, leaving a trail visible enough to encourage pursuit. A few bare footprints along the bank would have been enough to signal direction. Once the hunters committed themselves to the basin, the advantage would begin to shift. The riders would have been forced to leave their horses behind at the water's edge. Their lanterns, while useful for visibility, would also reveal their positions from a distance. Anyone watching from concealed ground could track their movement easily. At that point, the terrain itself would begin doing most of the work.
Balancing along narrow ridges required careful steps. Mud could pull at a person's legs with each movement. A misjudged turn might send someone waist-deep into water, where climbing out demanded both strength and time. A man struggling in mud could not hold a rifle steadily. None of the deputies suggested a dramatic battle had taken place. There was no evidence for that. No discharged weapons, no concentrated location where bodies might have fallen together. Instead, the scattered equipment hinted at something slower. A hat dropped while moving quickly, a lantern crushed underfoot, rope cut loose from its coil. The events might have unfolded over several minutes rather than a single confrontation. During one of the final surveys of the basin, a laborer discovered another detail that drew attention. Near the edge of one of the hidden ridges, partially buried beneath a thin layer of mud, lay a small iron tool commonly used for splitting wood. It did not belong to any of the missing hunters. The tool was simple and worn, the sort that might be carried by someone accustomed to manual work rather than professional tracking. Its presence suggested that at least one person inside the basin had arrived equipped with something other than ropes and firearms. The deputy who examined it did not draw immediate conclusions. He merely placed the object into a cloth bag and recorded its location. Later that evening, he reviewed his notes beside the campfire. Across several pages, the same pattern appeared repeatedly. Hunters entering the basin with lanterns and rifles, equipment gradually abandoned as the ground became more difficult, and signs that other individuals had moved through the marsh with greater familiarity. What the notes did not contain were clear indications of where the hunters themselves had gone. No bodies had been recovered, no grave sites located. No witness had stepped forward to describe the final moments. Yet among the men who had spent days inside the basin, a quiet understanding was beginning to form. The hunters had not simply become lost. Something had happened to them in the darkness of the marsh, carried out by people who understood that landscape far better than they did. By the second week, the search began to lose its initial urgency. Most practical areas of the basin had already been examined. The remaining sections were deeper and more difficult to navigate, places where water concealed the ground entirely. Probing them with poles produced little information beyond the depth of the mud beneath. Planters who had contributed men to the effort started recalling them to other duties. Fields required attention, wagons needed repairing. The disappearance of the hunters remained troubling, but daily work continued to demand labor. Before the camp was dismantled, however, the deputies conducted several final interviews with people who lived near the edge of the swamp. One conversation in particular was recorded in greater detail than the others. A woman who worked in a kitchen at a plantation a few miles north of the basin explained that on the night the hunters entered the forest, she had heard distant sounds drifting across the trees. She could not see the marsh from where she lived, but wind carried noise in unusual ways across the lowlands. At first, she believed it was ordinary movement, horses or men calling to one another in the dark. Later, the sounds changed. She described hearing brief shouts separated by long stretches of quiet. The voices were not close enough to distinguish words, but their tones suggested confusion rather than command. After a short time, even those noises faded. The woman offered the description calmly, as though recounting something she had considered many times before speaking about it. The deputy who wrote down her account asked whether she had reported the sounds earlier. She replied that no one had asked until now. Several other residents of the area provided similar recollections when questioned carefully. None described witnessing the event directly, yet more than one person remembered hearing voices somewhere within the swamp that night. These reports did not clarify what had taken place. They did, however, reinforce a particular detail. Whatever occurred inside the basin did not end immediately. The shouts heard from the forest suggested movement and reaction rather than a single sudden encounter. When the deputies reviewed these testimonies together, they began forming a restrained interpretation. The hunters had likely followed what appeared to be a clear trail into the marsh. Once inside, the difficult ground forced them apart. Lanterns would have illuminated only small circles of space, leaving large areas of darkness between them. At some point, they realized they were no longer pursuing a fleeing group. Instead, they were scattered across terrain controlled by people who knew every stable ridge and concealed patch of earth. In such conditions, even a small number of determined individuals could dictate where others moved. The hunters, who had entered the basin expecting to recover fugitives, gradually became the ones struggling to find solid ground. What happened after that remained uncertain. But the pattern of abandoned equipment, the hidden paths, and the distant shouts heard from the trees all pointed toward a slow unraveling rather than a sudden disappearance. In the months that followed, official interest in the disappearance gradually diminished. The deputies who had led the search filed their reports with the county clerk. These documents contained careful descriptions of the basin, lists of recovered equipment, and brief summaries of the statements gathered from nearby plantations. The language was restrained. Nothing in the records attempted to declare a final conclusion. The hunters were listed simply as missing. Plantation owners continued placing advertisements in newspapers for escaped laborers, though the wording in some notices became more cautious when referencing pursuits near swamp regions. Experienced riders understood the practical risks involved in certain terrain. The basin had quietly become one of those places. Over time, the story circulated in a different form. Among local residents, the disappearance was not discussed through official reports, but through recollection. People spoke about the night several hunters rode into the woods and never returned. They mentioned the horses found wandering near the clearing. They described the rifles left behind. These details remained consistent across retellings. Another element entered the story more gradually. Individuals who lived near the swamp sometimes remarked that, on certain evenings, voices could be heard faintly across the lowland forest. The sounds were usually described as distant shouts or brief cries carried by shifting air currents. Such reports were not unusual in wetlands. Sound behaves unpredictably over water and marsh grass. Conversations from far away can travel long distances, especially at night when the air cools and becomes still. A person standing near the basin might hear noises from hunters, travelers, or laborers working along distant tree lines. Yet the association with the earlier disappearance remained. Whenever voices drifted across the marsh after dark, some residents remembered the hunters who had entered the basin years before. The connection between the two ideas slowly hardened into local tradition. The deputies who had examined the area most closely did not record anything supernatural in their notes. Their observations suggested something simpler and more human. A group of fugitives, familiar with the hidden ridges and concealed patches of dry ground, had likely drawn their pursuers into a place where experience mattered more than weapons. Inside the basin, movement was slow, footing uncertain, and visibility limited. Under those conditions, a small number of people who understood the terrain could control how others moved. The hunters had entered the swamp believing they were restoring order defined by law and property.
Instead, they found themselves inside a landscape shaped by different knowledge developed quietly over years by those who worked and traveled there without recognition. What happened to the hunters after they became separated in the marsh was never documented with certainty. Their disappearance remained one of many incidents scattered through the deeper record of the American South, moments where official documents end before the full story becomes visible. The basin itself still exists, though its paths have shifted with time. And like many places shaped by difficult history, it carries a memory that survives not through monuments, but through quiet stories repeated by those who remember the night the slave catchers never came back. If you value careful examinations of overlooked historical events like this one, consider subscribing for more documented stories from the darker corners of the past.